Welcome everyone to the Chapter 13 video. We're going to talk about the major regions of the brain and their functions. So most of the volume of our brain is made up of the cerebrum. That's the largest part of the brain, and it's divided into two different hemispheres. Here we only see one side. The cerebrum is covered by a superficial layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex, its functions include conscious thought, memory, sensation, understanding, and control of voluntary muscles. And the gyri are folds that increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. And here we see a normal brain, and here we see Einstein's brain, and it is much more wrinkly, much more folds. That means he had more surface area for his cerebral cortex, and that's the part that does all your thinking. So that's why Einstein was smarter. And then if you look at the brain of a mentally retarded person, you don't see those gyri, so they don't have as much surface area. That's why they were not as smart. So the diencephalon is this region here. It's the structural and functional link between the cerebral hemispheres and the rest of the central nervous system. So it kind of links the cerebral hemispheres to the cerebellum and the spinal cord. The thalamus is here right in the middle. The thalamus contains relay and processing centers for sensory information. All of our sensory information has to go through the thalamus. Below the thalamus, we'll have the hypothalamus. It contains centers involved with emotion, autonomic function. We'll talk more about the autonomic nervous system next chapter. Also in the hypothalamus, you have some hormone production, and you'll learn about those hormones next semester. Back here we have the cerebellum, which coordinates and modulates motor commands. In what's called the brainstem, we have the midbrain. The midbrain processes visual and auditory information and controls reflexes. Then the pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem and functions in motor control. Then the medulla oblongata relays sensory information and contains centers that regulate heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure. So it's a pretty important thing to have intact. Inside the brain, we have these ventricles, which are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Ventricles, they're lined by ependymal cells. In this figure, we see the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres. And the brain is very well protected by bone, and then by the meninges, and then also by the cerebrospinal fluid, which we would find in here. If we look at the meninges, it's made up of three layers. The outer layer is the toughest. It's called the dura mater, very tough and fibrous. Then in the middle we have the arachnoid matter, and it looks like spider legs. That's how it got its name. In this layer is where we would find the cerebrospinal fluid. And then the pia mater, it's the inner layer, and it surrounds the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid, this is a close-up on a ventricle, and this shows how cerebrospinal fluid is produced. It's mostly water, and it comes from the blood. Wastes are sent back into the blood. It's produced in the ventricles, and then it's circulated throughout the brain, around the brain, and then also throughout the spinal cord. And then it gets reabsorbed into veins. Alright, next we're going to talk about the medulla oblongata, which is down here. In the medulla oblongata, sensory information is integrated and relayed, and there are several nuclei and relay stations. You don't need to know the individual ones, so be grateful for that. But know that the medulla does regulate heart rate and force of contraction of the heart, blood flow distribution, and respiratory movements. And in the pons here, the pons relays sensory and motor information to the cerebrum and cerebellum, and it can adjust the respiratory rate. Here's the respiratory centers in the pons, which you'll learn more about next semester. Then we have the cerebellum in the back of the brain. The cerebellum coordinates muscular activity at the subconscious level. The cerebellum receives sensory input and adjusts motor output accordingly to maintain balance. The cerebellum compares motor commands with proprioceptive information, which is the perception of muscle and joint position, to fine-tune movements. The cerebellum has a cortex like the cerebrum, which contains Purkinje cells. These cells can receive input from 200,000 synapses. Just think how long it would take you to even count that high. And these cells can be receiving input from 200,000 synapses at the same time. And then they integrate all that information and use that to allow you to produce smooth movements. Damage to the cerebellum results in what's called ataxia, A-T-A-X-I-A, which is a disturbance in muscle coordination. The midbrain, here's a posterior view of the midbrain. It regulates auditory and visual reflexes and controls alertness. The corpora quadrigemina, which you can see here, they are sensory nuclei that control reflexes. The reticular activating system, which you can see right in here, it makes you alert and attentive. Then we're going to talk about the thalamus next, which is in this area, kind of in the middle. The thalamus is a relay station for sensory information. And behind the thalamus we have the pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin, which is important for regulating day and night cycles. Then below the thalamus we have the hypothalamus. Here's a close-up on the hypothalamus. You can see it has many different centers. Be grateful you don't have to know what each one does. But there are centers that regulate cardiovascular function, body temperature, day-night cycles, probably eating and drinking are regulated here as well. And you can see things like cardiovascular function is regulated in two places because it's so important that way you have a backup. So it's regulated in the hypothalamus as well as the medulla oblongata. Just posterior to the hypothalamus we have the mammillary body. Mammillary bodies control feeding reflexes such as lipping and swallowing. It's pretty important for you to eat. Next we have the limbic system, which involves several areas of the brain, including parts of the cerebral cortex. The limbic system is responsible for emotion. We don't know a lot about emotion because it's just difficult to study. If we look at close-up, one part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is very important for learning and memory. This figure shows the basal nuclei down in here. The basal nuclei sometimes called the basal ganglia. They adjust and refine ongoing voluntary movements. Alright, the cerebral cortex, that's where we do all our thinking. It's divided into lobes, and they're color-coded in this picture. And different regions have specific functions. So here's another color-coded picture. So the motor cortex is going to be right in here, in red, and it controls voluntary movements. And we can map out the motor cortex and make what's called a homunculus. And this shows the part of the brain. This is a sagittal section of the brain that shows the part of the brain that controls, for example, this part controls the toes, this part controls the knee, this part controls the hand. And you can see there's a larger proportion designated for controlling the hand because the hand does much more precise movements than, for example, the trunk. And the face also has a large representation on the cortex. A lot of that is due to speech. And then we have a sensory one also, which looks pretty similar. It can also be represented like this. This is a three-dimensional homunculus. So I think this shows even better that a large proportion of the cortex is devoted to controlling the hands and the face. And same thing with sensation. You have much more fine sensation on your hands than you would on, say, your back. So that's the motor cortex and the homunculus. Some other areas we need to know. The somatic motor association area back here coordinates and plans movements. So first we plan the movements here, then the information is passed here. We'll talk about that later. The gustatory cortex receives information from taste receptors. The olfactory cortex receives information from smell receptors. The primary auditory cortex receives sound information. And then the auditory association area recognizes specific sounds like words. So the association areas turn what we get in the primary areas into things we can understand. And the sensory cortex is here. This is where that homunculus was made from. The sensory cortex receives information from touch receptors throughout the body. And then the somatic sensory association area allows us to recognize touch. In the back we have the primary visual cortex, which receives visual information. And the visual association area interprets visual information. Also in the brain we have integrative centers, which perform complex processes like speech, writing, math, and understanding spatial relationships. So we could call these our thinking areas. Right here you have the speech center, also called Broca's area, which produces speech. In blue here you have the prefrontal cortex, which is involved with several things like intellect, cognition, judgment, reasoning, emotion, and personality. Then we have the frontal eye field, which controls learned eye movements. And if we look at the cerebral hemispheres, they act contralaterally, and they have different functions. So that means, for example, the right hemisphere is controlling the left hand, and it's also receiving touch information from the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right hand and receives touch information from the right side of the body. But they are connected by the corpus callosum. Another way to look at this is using this picture. The left hemisphere is important for math and logic, so you see people working in cubicles, being engineers and stuff like that. On the right side, it's more important for creative activities and understanding 3D relationships. But there are bridges, and some people might be more left-brained or right-brained than another, and some people are pretty mixed. My wife calls the left side the nerd side, and the right side the common sense side. And you can guess what side I'm on and what side she's on. Alright, the white matter connects the different parts of the brain. So here's some fibers, white matter, myelinated axons, connecting different parts of the brain. Because we say that these different areas do different things, and they do. But in reality, it takes the whole cerebral cortex to do something, and the brain can change and adapt as needed. This is showing some of the other white matter that connects the different areas of the brain. An electroencephalogram, or an EEG for short, is a recording of the electrical activity of the brain. It is a very useful diagnostic tool. You can see they're putting marks on her forehead, and then they put electrodes in this, and they'll get a printout. Well, this shows the different types of white leaves, and if you want to become a neurologist, you can learn about them. Here's an example. On the left, you have someone that's having a seizure, so those waves aren't supposed to be happening. On the right, you have normal. So an EEG can tell you what's going on in your brain. Alright, next topic is the cranial nerves. And we need to know their function. So the first one is called the olfactory nerve, and its function is smell. Number 2 is the optic nerve, and its job is vision. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and it is an eye mover. It moves your eyes. Number 4 is the trochlear nerve, and it is another eye mover. Number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It controls sensation from the face, so these areas here, and then it also has a motor function. It innervates these muscles that are responsible for chewing. Then number 6, the abducens, is another eye mover. There are 6 muscles attached to each eye, so that's why we have 3 cranial nerves moving the eyes. So if you're ever not sure of a function, just guess eye movement. Next we have the facial nerve, which is responsible for facial expressions and taste. Then we have the vestibulocochlear, which is responsible for hearing and balance. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is responsible for taste and swallowing. Number 10 is the vagus nerve, and you can see it goes all over the place. It controls heart rate, breathing rate, also innervates the digestive system, also responsible for speech and taste. So if you're not sure, that's vagus nerve because it does the most stuff. Then we have the accessory nerve, which innervates the sternocleidomastoid muscle and allows you to turn your head. And finally, the hypoglossal nerve, which controls movement of the tongue. Next, we are going to talk about sensory receptors. And here's some examples of some sensory receptors. They are specialized cells or cell processes that provide your CNS with information about conditions in or outside the body. The general senses are found throughout the body, and they include temperature, pain, touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. And the awareness of changes in the external and internal environment is called sensation, and the conscious awareness of sensation is called perception. The conscious interpretation of sensation is perception. Each receptor has a unique receptive field. This allows us to localize things, like allow us to tell where something is touching us, or like where pain is coming from. And receptors are specific for a certain type of stimulus, such as light or touch. These are touch receptors. In our eye, we have receptors that are specialized for light. This shows the sensory pathway, so how we get from a stimulus to a response. The first thing that happens is a receptor is going to convert the stimulus energy, so the stimulus energy might be light energy or heat energy or kinetic energy in the form of touch, and it's going to turn that into an electrical signal. That process is called transduction. And if that electrical signal is strong enough, it may depolarize the receptor to a threshold, and at threshold an action potential will be generated. That action potential is going to travel over a labeled line, and that labeled line is specific for one type of stimulus, such as light. It travels over that labeled line to the CNS, and there's some processing that goes on in the CNS. Sometimes there's an involuntary response, like a reflex. But also we will perceive that, and a response will be generated. So maybe if we see something scary, we run away. The simplest receptors are just dendrites, and all receptors are really just modified dendrites. We can classify receptors based on their function, so you should know nociceptors are responsible for the sensation of pain. And there are two types. Type A are for fast or sharp pain. These activate reflexes and they can be localized. We also have type C, which is for slow or burning aching pain. This type of pain is harder to localize. Thermoreceptors are for temperature. Chemoreceptors are for chemicals. Smell and taste are senses that use chemoreceptors. Also pH uses chemoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors are for touch. Proprioceptors monitor the position of joints and muscles. Baroreceptors detect pressure changes. And tactile receptors provide the sensations of touch, pressure, and vibration. We can also classify receptors on whether they are tonic or phasic. So a tonic receptor is always active, and when the stimulus increases, the frequency of action potentials increases. And phasic receptors, they are normally inactive, and when the stimulus changes, they will send action potentials for a short time, and then when it changes again, they send more action potentials. So phasic receptors become active for a short time in response to a change. Alright, in our skin we have lots of sensory receptors. The first type are free nerve endings. These are sensitive to touch, pain, and temperature. We have root hair plexuses, which detect hair movement. We have tactile discs and Merkel cells, which are touch receptors. We have tactile corpuscles, which sense pressure and vibration. We have lamellated corpuscles, which detect deep pressure and vibration. And if you want to know why it's important to detect vibration, watch Jurassic Park. It will let you know if there's a dinosaur sneaking up on you. Also in the skin we have Ruffini corpuscles, which respond to stretch. And there are several different pathways, and you don't need to memorize these pathways, but just be aware. This is the spinal thalamic pathway, which goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus. It is bringing sensory information to the brain. There's also the posterior column pathway, which goes along the posterior column of the spinal cord. And then there's the spinocerebellar pathway, which is bringing information from proprioceptors from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. These are all carrying sensory information to the brain. And this shows where they are in the spinal cord, the posterior column pathway, the spinocerebellar, and then the spinal cord. We also have the corticospinal pathway, which goes from the cortex down to the spinal cord. It sends motor information to the muscles through both the medial and the lateral pathways. There are multiple levels of somatic motor control, each one getting more complex. So the simplest is the brainstem and the spinal cord, which controls simple reflexes. Those might be monosynaptic reflexes. Then the next level up is the pons and medulla oblongata. They control more complex balance and respiratory reflexes. And the next higher up is the hypothalamus, which controls reflexes related to eating, drinking, and sexual activity. And any of these centers can influence the centers below it, but not above it. The next level up, we have the thalamus and the midbrain. They control reflexes in response to visual and auditory stimuli. And next we have the basal nuclei, which can modify the voluntary and reflexive motor patterns subconsciously. And we have the cerebral cortex, which plans and initiates voluntary motor activity. And then the highest level is the cerebellum, and actually the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum communicate with each other. So the cerebellum coordinates complex motor patterns through feedback loops involving the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, and sensory information. When you are planning a movement, this is what goes on. When you're planning a movement, information is relayed from the frontal lobes, where we make the decision, to the motor association areas, which are going to send information to the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. And then when the movement begins, the motor association areas send instructions to the primary motor cortex, and feedback from the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. And modify these commands. And as the movement proceeds, the cerebellum monitors proprioceptive and balance information and adjusts motor neurons accordingly. Last thing for this chapter is some disorders. Referred pain happens when strong pain signals stimulate nearby neurons. Most people know pain in the heart can radiate out to the arm. This is a normal substantia nigra, and this is some of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease results when dopamine-releasing neurons of the substantia nigra degenerate. This leads to problems initiating and controlling movements. It can be treated with L-DOPA, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and be turned into dopamine. Hopefully one day stem cells. Cerebral palsy occurs due to improper development of motor neurons and negatively affects voluntary movements. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, is a degenerative disorder that affects motor neurons. It leads to atrophy of the associated skeletal muscles. It's also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Alzheimer's disease is caused by plaques and neurofibrillary tangles forming on neurons. When this happens, they can't work right, and it leads to dementia. Multiple sclerosis is a disease caused by demyelination of neurons. You can see the myelin sheath is gone from this neuron, so now the action potential is not going to be able to travel as fast, and it will affect the regions served by those neurons. Then this is epilepsy, which has been described as a lightning storm in your brain. Action potentials happen when they're not supposed to. Epilepsy affects about 1% of the population. It does not cause any intellectual impairments. Neurons become active when they're not supposed to. It leads to loss of consciousness, and if it affects the motor cortex, it can lead to uncontrollable jerking. It can be treated with GABA agonists. Remember, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if we have more inhibitory neurotransmitters, we're less likely to generate action potentials when we don't want them. The only problem is the side effects are that it's harder to generate action potentials when you do want them. So all the treatments for epilepsy lead to fatigue. There's a newer treatment called a vagus nerve stimulator, which attaches to the vagus nerve and sends regular stimulation to the brain. And by giving the brain a regular stimulation all the time, the thinking is that it keeps the abnormal action potentials from happening when they're not supposed to. And that is chapter 13.